All right, by now I'm sure all of you guys have seen the footage of this wild bridge collapse in Baltimore, Maryland, earlier this morning on March 26, 2024. And this is one of those things where I'm not quite sure what to make of this. By all accounts, it seems to be an accident. But at the same time, as I will go into in this video, there is a lot of circumstantial symbolism pointing towards this event happening. And I will leave it to you to be the judge of where on the spectrum this falls between planning and coincidence. First, for those of you who have not seen it yet, I'm going to play a couple videos of the actual collapse so we can get an idea of what really transpired. I mean, look at that. Wow, the boat hits it down here at this support and the whole thing just collapses. Then there's this view, which shows it from a different angle. And it takes this turn left right at the last second into the actual support beam. And then boom, it falls down. The biggest thing is you can see the power's out here, and then it comes back on, and then it goes back off, and then it comes back on right before it turns into the bridge. Clearly there's some kind of malfunction going on with their power system, and by default I would assume the navigation system. I don't know anything about shipping containers. I have no idea how they work, so I can't really comment on what is going on here. I would have to leave that to some kind of expert on these things. I'm sure we'll learn more about it in the coming days. But if you just look at this, it seems like an accident. Hey, this ship is experiencing something wrong with its power system, and it's going on and off flickering, and then it just turns into the support beam right in the middle of the bridge, and the whole thing comes down. Unbelievable. Now, there might be people listening to this video who aren't familiar with all of the videos I've done on the Great American Eclipse. Accordingly, I'm going to go over a lot of that stuff very quickly just to set the scene for you when I get into stuff that relates specifically to this bridge. The first thing is how this bridge collapse relates to The Dark Knight Rises and the terrorist attack that transpired in Russia on March 22nd, 2024. In The Dark Knight Rises, Christopher Nolan shows a terrorist scene led by Bane in the context of the movie, where they show this 322 press box right before it explodes. And then in Tenet, another Christopher Nolan movie, they show this press box scene in a Ukrainian opera filmed in a Russian building where terrorists storm the theater and the concert that's going on, which very closely mirrors scenes from what happened in Russia, as you can see here, on 3/22/24. In other words, Christopher Nolan foreshadows the 3/22 terrorist attack in Russia involving Ukraine in terms of the timeline back when he made The Dark Knight Rises. Additionally, as a part of this scene and the larger terrorist attack orchestrated by Bane, Christopher Nolan then shows a bunch of bridges being destroyed in Gotham, which I will play right now. And you can see that the bridges are destroyed right after the 322 press box is blown up. Meaning not only is the 322 pointing towards what happened in Russia on 322, but there's also this bridge collapse resonance to the same scene. And the player who kicked off that terrorist attack, metaphorically speaking, was Raven's stall. And in the prior video, I got into how the Super Bowl, following the release of The Dark Knight Rises, had the 13:22 or 3:22 stoppage of time in the third quarter when the lights went out for 34 minutes. Raven's stall kicks that off, and obviously the Baltimore Ravens were in that Super Bowl, so you have this bridge collapse resonance to Baltimore in The Dark Knight Rises. And if you think about it, Raven's stall, it's evoking this idea of that ship stalling in Baltimore and collapsing the bridge. And at first you might say, well, that's a coincidence. Okay, let's keep going, because it just so happens that the bridge that collapsed is called the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And for those of you who do not live in America, Francis Scott Key wrote our national anthem. In terms of the Great American Eclipse, ritual destruction of America, there is nothing more symbolic than a bridge named after the national anthem being destroyed. This is what I was getting into about the fractals and the mini rituals. This is a fractal of the larger destruction ritual, where the Francis Scott Key Bridge is destroyed. And in terms of Raven's stall, if you go look at the news stories, they're speculating on whether or not the Port of Baltimore will now be shut down from this bridge collapse. And that is what happened in The Dark Knight Rises. Those bridges are all destroyed, which cuts Gotham off from the outside world. Nothing can get in or out. As the USA Today says here, this does not mean the Port of Baltimore is shut down. We are still processing trucks inside our terminals, the statement said, but Bloomberg reported that the port looks to be out of commission indefinitely. At least 40 ships are now more or less trapped inside the port. According to Reuters, at least 30 other ships plan to arrive there. They will likely have to reroute shipping to other ports on the East Coast. However, this will put additional demand on these ports, and shippers may not be able to access U.S. markets. So, coincidence or plan, this is going to have a huge effect on the Port of Baltimore, and it's really evoking those scenes from The Dark Knight Rises. What are the odds that The Dark Knight Rises encodes this 322 terrorist attack in 2024, and then 5 days later, a bridge collapses relating to Baltimore and Raven's stall, and a power outage in the Super Bowl that followed, where you have this ship that is clearly experiencing a power outage before it crashes into the bridge. Christopher Nolan has some explaining to do, I think. And then there's the fact that the bridge was hit by a ship that was out of Singapore. And this is Singapore's flag, where you have the eclipse imagery being shown here in the context of a pentagon, Baltimore, Maryland being very close to Washington, D.C., and the Pentagon that exists there, which then ties in the 9/11 aspect of the Great American Eclipse ritual. Washington, D.C., and the Pentagon. Donald Trump, the twin 9/11 moonchild. Flight 175 crashing into America. All of this transpiring on the heels of a lunar eclipse on March 24th and March 25th, 2024, 2 weeks before the April 8th leg of the Great American Eclipse. In this connection, According to the Daily Mail, which we'll take with a grain of salt as always, the cargo ship Dolly was being piloted by a local crew trained to avoid obstacles in the Baltimore port. As it emerges, 100,000-ton vessel lost control and propulsion moments before smashing into the bridge. And a lot of people have brought this angle of it up looking at this scene where Leave the World Behind, which involves a power outage and cyber attack, features a huge cargo ship that loses its navigation as a part of the cyber attack and runs into the shoreline. But anyway, this bridge actually opened on March 23rd, 1977, one day after 322, and it just celebrated its 47th anniversary. Those of you who have been following my videos on this should have the fireworks going off in your mind right now as it relates to the 47th anniversary that the bridge just had 3 days ago in relationship to Donald Trump and Agenda 47, in terms of the fact that if Donald Trump is elected in 2024, he will be the 47th president of the United States. In other words, the Francis Scott Key Bridge is destroyed right after its 47th anniversary. Meaning the national anthem, America, is destroyed on the 47th anniversary, evoking the idea that Donald Trump, the 47th president, potentially will destroy the United States of America, which ties right into the theme that's been ongoing with this great American eclipse as it relates to Donald Trump and domestic terrorism, and just in general, the collapse of the United States of America as the twin of the 9/11/2001 ritual. Unbelievable, right? And then you have the Matthew Perry ritual sacrifice where he died in a blood bath in a hot tub, pronounced dead at 4:17, and the original 911 call was at 4:07. And Matthew Perry's ritual was connected into Batman, which connects it back to The Dark Knight Rises and the lunar eclipse that was taking place on October 28, 2023, when Matthew Perry died. In relationship to Donald Trump, this lunar eclipse on March 25th and the Great American Eclipse. Again, as shown here in the Singapore flag that this Dolly ship was a part of. Also, the cargo ship crashed into the bridge at 1:28 a.m., which just so happens to be 88 minutes after midnight. Obviously, there is this long tradition of referring to midnight being when the clock runs out. And that's evoking all of that out of time Back to the Future programming at the same time that it is evoking the Dark Knight clock stops programming, the Raven stall, which I got into a little bit in the last video on the nature of the internet and our interaction with it as it relates to us potentially being quantum leaped out of time. Our stream of consciousness projected into a new dimension or reality where time does not exist as it did prior to our infusion with the internet. We are all feeling this in some way, shape, or form. All of us have this feeling that time isn't moving like it used to. Things seem very sped up. And that's probably in part due to the influence of all of this information attempting to be processed by a brain that has never had to try to process that much information at one time, while simultaneously the slow merger of human physiology with digital technology is very literally moving the human body out of time in terms of the third dimension as we used to perceive it. The flow of time, that is. These are the countdowns that you find in films like Donnie Darko relating to the end of the world and associating Donnie Darko, the Eclipse baby, Donald Trump, with the end of time because he is the moon child influencing us with his gravitational pull in that context during this time when we are moving out of time, as it were, metaphorically speaking. Mechanical time isn't quite fitting with reality as we perceive it now. And that then relates to that White Rabbit CERN story that came out on 322 as well, relating to timing technology and the standardization of time on a quantum level. Also, on March 21st, 2024, the same day that Three Body Problem is released, with a similar theme relating to black holes and the human eye and how those are symbolically interchangeable in film and the real world, where, for example, the Las Vegas sphere is a symbolic black hole, which we traverse through and make contact with the subconscious programming, whether that's something they build in a city, like in Las Vegas, or it's depicted in a film like it is in Contact. And incidentally, Contact was made by Robert Zemeckis, who is also behind Dark Castle, the production that made Roadhouse, but it was directed by Joel Silver, and Silver is the 47th element, which then is getting back to this idea of the 47th anniversary of this Francis Scott Key Bridge that collapsed. Remembering that Roadhouse takes place in the Florida Keys. Keeping in mind that boats and water are all over this new Roadhouse movie in the Florida Keys. Obviously, the Florida Keys are associated with bridges in general because you have to take this huge, long bridge over the water to get there. And then Donnie Darko's character, played by Jake Gyllenhaal in Roadhouse, lives on something just called the boat. So they've associated Donnie Darko with the boat in this film, which is Donald Trump, right? So the boat is Donald Trump that crashes into the Francis Scott Key Bridge, symbolically destroying America. The Key Bridge, for short, is what they call it in Baltimore, and this is taking place in the Florida Keys. There are all kinds of scenes of Donnie Darko here on the water in a boat. And there's even a scene where two boats crash together in an accident, and then additionally, right before this scene, there is an explosion that blows up a boat in the middle of the ocean. And then there is an actual scene where Donnie Darko is on a bridge in the Florida Keys and a car tries to run him over, and he falls over the bridge in the Florida Keys into the water, and the car follows him over the bridge into the water. What are the odds of that? That Donnie Darko, Donald Trump, goes over a bridge in the Florida Keys and a car follows him into the water in the context of this boat that crashes into this bridge that causes people and cars to fall into the water. Hopefully you understand what I was getting at now about the line being blurred between coincidence and planning. Surely it's not a coincidence that Robert Zemeckis, involved in Contact, which has the same Florida residence via Pensacola, and Three Body Problem released the same day with the Magic Beach scene, takes place at Cape Canaveral in Florida as well. All of this Florida residence going on in the films that are released in this lunar eclipse window 2 weeks before the Great American Eclipse relating to Contact, the White Rabbit Magic Beach, and this eclipse, 618 area code over Little Egypt, the time stops when Neo hits the alarm at 6:18 in the Matrix after he follows the White Rabbit. In other words, the Magic Beach and the White Rabbit evoking this idea of contact, quantum leaping consciousness into a different dimension or into a different point in time where it meets a more advanced intelligence that alters it in some way or changes it in some way. All of that is symbolically taking place via this Zemeckis production, taking place in the Florida Keys 5 days before the Key Bridge is destroyed. In the same window in time where The Dark Knight Rises and Christopher Nolan has all of this resonance to what transpired in Russia on 322 and also bridges collapsing in relationship to 322. And obviously bridges in a more symbolic sense have the same kind of black hole meaning, where it represents the way to get from one point to another. And that's kind of what is symbolically at work here in terms of taking the collective stream of consciousness and sending it somewhere else. And then relating to Kate Middleton's 322 video that came out at the same time the Russian terrorist attack news was released, you have this Sean Combs story where he fled from Los Angeles and went out through Florida, and then they lost contact with the plane he was on somewhere out here in the water. Very interesting that he leaves out through Florida as well, and there are these pictures of him circulating with Prince Harry now, because he was named in the lawsuit. Not in any sort of implication way, but just named in it. Putting him out there during this window in time as it relates to Kate Middleton and that whole story. And then this is the path that the boat took. And I just have to sit here and ask the question, is this a Sandy Hook, right? Now, I want to be careful because people most likely died as a result of this accident. And I don't want to imply that it was intentional if it really wasn't. But it's just hard to look at all of this stuff and not see some type of hidden hand behind the scenes orchestrating all of this. And it could be an accident at the same time that it was intentional or planned. Just think of it like this. Imagine you have a chip in a basketball that can be utilized through technology, bringing the ball closer into the metal rim when you want it to be, which would help you make shots or miss shots depending on what you wanted to transpire. Well, their technology is on a level that we can't even imagine. So would it really be so difficult to sabotage the controls on a ship like this and then steer it into a bridge, pulling it like a giant magnet in the same way that you would pull a ball towards metal? And everyone on the boat who was trained to navigate this Baltimore harbor wouldn't be able to stop it. They would be powerless. The power is going on and off. They're losing control of the steering in the same way that you would lose control of steering in your car if something like that happened when your alternator goes out. But in this instance, it's the boat going into the bridge. And no one would have any idea on the boat that this was intentional, and they would all go on the news and say, yeah, it was just an accident. But then at the same time, there's all of this programming that shows, hey, maybe this was planned, especially remembering that this is the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which represents the national anthem of America and in essence then represents what America is and what it was designed to be originally when it was created. which is now being destroyed symbolically. And it's known as the Key Bridge for short in the context of this Roadhouse movie that was released 5 days earlier, taking place in the Florida Keys, that has all of this boat explosion crashing imagery in the context of the Great American Eclipse and Donnie Darko resonating with Donald Trump, where he very literally goes over the Key Bridge in the Florida Keys and a car follows him into the water. When you leave that viewing of the film Roadhouse, all you have in your mind 5 days before this happens are boats, water, and crashes. And bridges. And again, Raven's stall, this Baltimore Raven ship stalled in the middle of the harbor and crashed into the bridge, which Christopher Nolan shows in The Dark Knight Rises multiple times. There's even another bridge explosion later in the movie, right before it ends, which then relates back to the 322 and the Russian terrorist attack that transpired on that day, 322, 4 days before this bridge collapsed. And you have the Raven stall in the blue in the context of the yellow, which evokes Ukraine. And then the Pittsburgh Steelers played in the Super Bowl, known as Super Bowl 30, which was the Super Bowl that the Friends episode aired after, featuring Julia Roberts, which then ties back into Leave the World Behind and the power going out, the cyber attack, and the ship running aground as a part of that overall terrorist attack, because, of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers play at Heinz Field, and that is where this was filmed. A bridge hit by a Singapore ship that has the eclipse imagery 2 weeks before the Great American Eclipse, with the Pentagon imagery as well. Finally, for the cherry on top of this whole thing, in the context of Francis Scott Key Bridge and Francis Scott Key writing the United States national anthem, as a part of this whole sequence in The Dark Knight Rises, this boy sings the national anthem right before kickoff of the terrorist attack, and everything that I just went over transpiring. This is all one scene in The Dark Knight Rises. And as was pointed out to me by a commenter, just as I was finishing up this video, this Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse is the 86th day of the year, remembering that Hines Ward in this scene, after the stadium collapses, is wearing number 86. And then obviously Robert Pattinson, who was in Tenet, goes on to be the next Batman. Tying it all together, right? Unbelievable stuff. Again, I don't want to reinforce what people like Controlled Opposition Alex Jones and Andrew Tate are saying, where right after it happens, they're out here without any kind of evidence saying stuff like this, which then ties into the censorship angle where, hey, eventually we need to censor people like this who are saying these things without any kind of evidence and contributing to the misinformation problem that radicalizes people. At the very least, even if this was deliberate in some way, like I was alluding to previously, these types of people will take that narrative and turn it into something completely absurd that discredits it at the same time that they discuss it. So always, if you're new to this, be on the lookout for that. Don't fall for this kind of stuff. Stay patient and let things unfold and keep an open mind. Because this very easily could have just been a coincidence. Is that likely? Probably not. But like I said, I'll leave that up to you to decide. I'm just laying out all of the circumstantial evidence here. So that's it for now. Later.